Corporate America is not built on synergy. It runs on caffeine, pure spite, and duct-taped code written by the 99% of exhausted ghosts you ignore. When slick suits try replacing 20 years of calloused competence with cheap spreadsheet shortcuts, the crash is spectacular. Want to hear how they tried automating a company's heartbeat with a fragile macro buckle-up? We are driving off a cliff, and I am the only one holding a parachute. Hello to the wonderful audience of Boss Revenge Stories. Our channel was recently demonetized by YouTube, leaving us without the budget to keep the lights on and our team paid. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the description and pinned comment, so our hardworking staff can pay their living expenses and continue bringing these stories to life. My name is Harper Campbell. I am 34 years old, and I am a data specialist who has somehow survived 3 separate rounds of layoffs at OmniMed Logistics. OmniMed is a massive corporate beast sitting right here in the sweltering heat of Atlanta, Georgia. We are the invisible gears turning behind the scenes, responsible for supplying and cutting the paychecks for thousands of travel nurses, paramedics, and ambulance drivers all the way up and down the East Coast. If an emergency room in Boston or a mobile clinic in Miami has boots on the ground, we are the ones making sure those boots can afford to buy groceries at the end of the week. But here's the dirty little secret about this multi-million-dollar logistics empire. Our core system is a digital Frankenstein monster held together by spit, prayer, and absolute desperation. Every single week, shift data pours in from over 50 different hospital networks. None of them talk to each other. None of them use the same software. We get data dumped on us in chaotic, fragmented formats. We are dealing with raw text files, poorly formatted spreadsheets, and proprietary exports that look like a cat walked across a keyboard. Add in the nightmare of time zone conflicts across the coast, overlapping overtime rules for different state labor laws, and shift differentials for night crews, and you have a recipe for a catastrophic payroll failure every single Friday. The suits upstairs thought the system ran smoothly because they bought some expensive enterprise software 5 years ago. They had absolutely no idea why it actually worked. It worked because of me. 2 years ago, after watching our accounting department absolutely melt down over a batch of corrupted data from a hospital in New Jersey, I quietly built an independent piece of middleware. I coded it from scratch on my own time. It was a custom script designed to intercept that massive avalanche of garbage data, filter out the formatting errors, resolve the time zone conflicts, and standardize everything before it ever touched the official accounting database. I did not ask for permission, and I certainly did not get a single dime of overtime for building it. I did it because those thousands of nurses out there working 12 or 14-hour shifts, pulling double duties in understaffed emergency rooms, deserve to get their paychecks on time. My little piece of duct tape code became the sole beating heart of OmniMed Logistics. I owned it, I maintained it, and it ran flawlessly in the background, completely invisible to the executives who signed my modest paycheck. But in corporate America, peace never lasts. The atmosphere in the office began to shift around the end of the third quarter. You could smell the scent of optimization in the air, thick and foul. Rumors of aggressive cost-cutting measures started floating around the break room water cooler. Suddenly, the top floor was flooded with a brand new lineup of upper management executives. They marched through the hallways in their custom-tailored suits, armed with empty buzzwords like synergy, lean management, and agile integration. They did not know a single thing about how our data actually flowed, but they were absolutely determined to fix things that were not broken just to justify their bloated salaries. They looked at the IT department not as the engine of the company, but as a liability on a balance sheet. I am not a naive person. When you spend enough time in the blue-collar trenches of the tech world, you develop a sixth sense for incoming disasters. My radar went off loud and clear on a random Tuesday morning. I was in the middle of clearing out a syntax error from a hospital in Maryland when a notification popped up on my screen. It was a sudden, mandatory calendar invite. The subject line read, Payroll process restructuring. The sender was Marcus, our newly minted vice president of operations. A man who had been with the company for exactly 3 weeks. The meeting was set for 2 o'clock that afternoon. There was no agenda attached. There were no other IT staff invited. It was just me, Marcus, and the scent of a corporate firing squad waiting in the glass-walled conference room at the end of the hall. I took a slow sip of my stale, lukewarm coffee, looked at my monitor, and knew instantly that the storm had finally arrived. I pushed open the heavy glass door of the main conference room exactly at 2 o'clock. The air conditioning in there was always set to a freezing temperature, but the chill in the room had nothing to do with the thermostat. Marcus was sitting at the head of the mahogany table. He had his hands steepled together in that classic, aggressive posture they teach you in executive seminars. Next to him stood a kid who could not have been older than 24. This was Preston. Preston was fresh out of an Ivy League Master of Business Administration program. He was wearing a ridiculously expensive fleece vest over a designer button-down shirt, and he looked at me with the kind of smug, half-lidded expression usually reserved for people examining an interesting insect on their shoe. Marcus did not bother with pleasantries. He gestured vaguely toward the projector screen illuminating the dark wall. "Harper, take a seat. Preston here has been conducting a deep dive into our back-end operational expenditures. He has developed a streamlined solution that is going to revolutionize how we handle the payroll pipeline." I looked at the screen. My stomach did a slow, heavy roll. Displayed in high definition on the wall was Microsoft Excel. It was a massive, violently color-coded spreadsheet filled with dozens of tabs and an overly complicated dashboard. Preston cleared his throat, puffed out his chest, and began his presentation. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who had only ever experienced business through textbook case studies. "What you are looking at," Preston announced, "is a fully automated, dynamic macro environment. I spent the last 2 weeks programming this. It utilizes advanced Visual Basic scripts to ingest the hospital attendance logs, cross-reference the hourly rates, and output a clean file for accounting. By eliminating the manual oversight and sunsetting the legacy middleware you currently manage, my model will save OmniMed Logistics upwards of $300,000 in operational overhead in the first fiscal year alone." I stared at the screen, then at Preston, and finally at Marcus. I honestly thought it was a joke. I waited for the punchline. When neither of them cracked a smile, the horrifying reality set in. They were completely serious. They were going to replace a resilient, custom-built data pipeline with an oversized calculator. "Preston," I started, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. "Excel is a brilliant tool for financial modeling. It is not an enterprise-grade database engine. You cannot feed 50 different disjointed hospital export files into a macro and expect it to survive. Have you accounted for the ghost shifts?" Preston blinked. "Ghost shifts." "Yes, ghost shifts," I explained, my voice rising slightly. "When a trauma nurse clocks out in Virginia at 11:59 at night, but the local hospital server crashes and registers the punch at midnight, it creates a duplicate entry across 2 different pay periods. My system isolates those anomalies. Your spreadsheet will just pay them twice. And what about the time zone differentials? We have paramedics driving across state lines. If you rely on a Visual Basic script to reconcile timestamps without standardizing the raw text first, it will completely corrupt the shift durations." Preston scoffed, adjusting his expensive collar. "The macros are robust. Harper, they use standard text-to-column delimiting. It is highly efficient." "It is a ticking bomb," I fired back, abandoning pleasantries. "Do you even know the row limit in Excel?" "It is 1,048,576 rows. We process over 500,000 lines of raw data every single week. If a hospital in New Jersey sends a corrupted batch with trailing blank spaces, your macro will hit the row limit and crash instantly. Worse, Excel automatically strips leading zeros. Half of our employee identification numbers start with a 0. Your macro is going to delete them, and the accounting software will reject the entire batch. Nobody will get paid." Marcus slammed his hand flat on the table. The sharp sound echoed off the glass walls. Enough. Harper, this is exactly the kind of legacy mindset that is holding OmniMed back. You are defensive because Preston has exposed the inefficiency in your department. We need agile, lean solutions, not gatekeepers who refuse to adapt. He leaned forward, his eyes cold and dead. Your position has been deemed redundant. Effective immediately, your employment at OmniMed Logistics is terminated. We will provide a standard severance package, contingent on a full and seamless handover. I need your admin credentials, your system passwords, and your keycard on this table right now. The silence that followed was heavy. I looked at Marcus, then at Preston, who was failing to hide a victorious smirk. They were tossing me out onto the street to save a fraction of a percent on their bottom line, entrusting the livelihood of thousands of healthcare workers to a 24-year-old kid who thought a spreadsheet was a magic wand. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a deep, icy calm. A slow smile crept onto my face. It was the kind of smile that should have terrified them if they had any survival instincts at all. "Understood," I said softly. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my security badge, and placed it gently next to Marcus's coffee mug. I wrote down the master passwords for the server arrays on a sticky note and slid it over to Preston. I stood up and pushed my chair in. Before I turned toward the door, I looked Preston dead in the eyes. One last piece of advice. Preston, since you are the captain of the ship now, do not ever let the raw data touch those macros before midnight. The system servers run their local backups at 11:45. If your script pulls the files while the lock protocol is active, it will shatter the formatting permanently. Preston just rolled his eyes, utterly dismissive. I think I know how to run a data query. Harper, you can let security escort yourself out. Good luck, I whispered. I walked out of the glass room, leaving them alone with their shiny new toy, completely unaware that they had just pulled the pin out of a grenade. The walk back to my cubicle felt lighter than it had in 8 long years. The familiar hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant chatter of the sales team suddenly sounded like white noise fading into the background. I grabbed a flattened cardboard box from the IT supply closet. I did not have much to take, really. A chipped coffee mug that proudly declared me the world's okayest coder, a heavy mechanical keyboard I had brought from home, and a small, encrypted hard drive containing my personal side projects. That was the sum total of my physical existence at OmniMed Logistics. Preston did not even give me 5 minutes of peace. He hovered over my shoulder, tapping his expensive leather shoes against the cheap gray carpet, practically vibrating with the arrogance of a man who thought he had just conquered the digital world. I am going to need those server credentials right now, Preston demanded, checking his heavy gold watch with an exaggerated sigh. We are porting the regional data streams into my macro environment by 5 o'clock sharp, and I need all legacy systems taken offline before the migration. Sure thing, Preston, I replied, keeping my voice incredibly smooth and polite. This is the beautiful, quiet magic of malicious compliance. I sat down at my terminal for the very last time and handed over exactly what OmniMed Logistics legally owned. I typed out the administrative logins for the local network infrastructure, surrendered the root access to the accounting software, and transferred the ownership of the company-owned database servers. I did everything entirely by the book. But here's the devastating little detail that Marcus and his shiny new prodigy completely missed in their blind rush to optimize me out of a paycheck. 2 years ago, when I built the complex middleware that actually kept this entire payroll system afloat, I hosted the core engine on my own private cloud infrastructure. I wrote the code on a Sunday afternoon, sitting on my living room couch, using my own personal laptop. OmniMed never officially commissioned it. They never audited the architecture, and most importantly, they never paid a single cent to license the intellectual property. It belonged entirely to me. So, while Preston was busy marveling at his newfound administrative power and printing out the password list, I quietly opened a hidden terminal window on my second monitor. I logged into my personal repository with 3 deliberate keystrokes. I revoked the application programming interface keys. I permanently terminated the access license that allowed the company network to route its traffic through my personal code. I systematically dismantled the invisible, bulletproof safety net that had been silently catching their garbage data for 24 months. I left their corporate network completely naked, entirely exposed to the raw, unfiltered, and violent chaos of 50 different hospital mainframes. "All yours," I said, offering a tight, professional smile as I stepped away from the desk. I walked out the front glass doors of the building, and the sweltering Atlanta heat hit me like a heavy, physical wave. It felt glorious. For the first time in nearly a decade, my brain was not actively worrying about server uptime or synchronization errors. I stood on the pavement, pulled out my smartphone, went deep into the contact settings, and systematically blocked every single corporate phone number, email address, and messaging channel associated with OmniMed Logistics. I severed the digital umbilical cord completely. I drove straight away from the corporate park and found a dimly lit, sticky-floored dive bar on the edge of town. I sat on a cracked leather stool and ordered a glass of neat Kentucky bourbon. The amber liquid burned perfectly going down. I sat there in the quiet hum of the empty tavern, listening to the ceiling fan chop the stale air, savoring the absolute, untethered freedom of unemployment. For the next 48 hours, I completely dropped off the grid. I packed my hiking boots and drove way up into the Blue Ridge Mountains. I spent Wednesday and Thursday entirely surrounded by tall pine trees and absolute silence. There were no cell towers up there. There were no frantic digital pings. There were no panicked emails. I breathed in the crisp, cool mountain air, completely detached from the reality of what was happening back down in the city. Because down there, in the sterile, air-conditioned server rooms of OmniMed Logistics, Preston was eagerly feeding his shiny new spreadsheet. His precious Excel macro was just beginning to ingest the first few 100,000 lines of unformatted, raw shift data, slowly choking on the digital poison I used to filter out. The pressure was building in the pipes. The system was silently screaming, and I was miles away, happily watching the clouds roll by. Friday morning arrived with the subtlety of a runaway freight train crashing into a glass factory. Deep inside the sterile, climate-controlled corporate server rooms, precisely at midnight, the automated triggers had engaged. Preston, brimming with unearned confidence, had proudly scheduled his macro environment to automatically ingest the week's raw operational data. Exactly 500,000 lines of chaotic, unfiltered text poured into the fragile Microsoft Excel architecture. It did not just fail, it detonated spectacularly. Without my protective middleware to catch the relentless formatting inconsistencies, the disaster was instantaneous. A hospital in Richmond submitted their timestamps using a 24-hour format with no colon delimiter, while a trauma clinic in Charlotte used a 12-hour format packed with trailing blank spaces. The Visual Basic script choked on the very first batch. A single displaced comma from a facility in Baltimore caused a massive, irreversible column shift. The script blindly yanked the data sideways, completely misaligning the headers. The system suddenly registered 9-digit employee identification numbers as the total hours worked for the week. The standard hourly pay rates were subsequently multiplied against numbers in the hundreds of millions. Meanwhile, other columns shifted the opposite direction, registering null values and replacing actual 50-hour work weeks with absolute zero. Because Preston had ignored my warning about the midnight server lock, the macro forced its way through the security protocols, overwriting the fail-safe backups. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the corrupted batch file had been automatically rubber-stamped, encrypted, and blindly forwarded to the central payroll clearinghouse. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the sun began to rise over the East Coast, and the automated direct deposit notifications started hitting the smartphones of thousands of exhausted medical professionals. The reaction was instantaneous, visceral, and explosive. A pediatric intensive care nurse in Philadelphia opened her banking application in the hospital cafeteria only to find a staggering negative balance. Her digital pay stub indicated she somehow owed OmniMed Logistics $84,000 for the privilege of working 4 consecutive night shifts. A veteran paramedic in Miami, who had just finished a grueling 72-hour rotation, stared blankly at a digital receipt showing a net payout of exactly 0 cents. Across dozens of states, private messaging groups, text threads, and social media channels erupted into absolute frenzy. The men and women who kept the emergency rooms functioning were already stretched thin by the demands of the healthcare system. These were people who operated on pure caffeine, adrenaline, and necessity. When you mess with the livelihood of blue-collar heroes, you do not just get a complaint ticket, you get a revolution. The backlash was not a slow wave, it was a vertical wall of crushing water. By 7:30 in the morning, the spontaneous walkouts began. Nurses who were scheduled for the crucial morning rotations simply refused to swipe their security badges. Paramedics parked their ambulances in the loading bays, killed the engines, and tossed the keys directly onto the dispatchers' desks. Emergency rooms from Boston to Tampa found themselves catastrophically understaffed in the span of a single hour. The domino effect reached the executive floor of OmniMed Logistics before the morning coffee had even finished brewing. Hospital administrators, facing massive liability issues and immediate life-threatening patient care crises, bypassed the customer service lines entirely. They started calling the private cell phones of OmniMed's upper management. The threats hurled through the receivers were not subtle. Chief executive officers of major medical networks were screaming at Marcus, promising multi-million-dollar lawsuits for catastrophic breach of staffing contracts. They demanded immediate personnel replacements that simply did not exist. The corporate headquarters transformed into a war zone. Executives were sprinting down the hallways. Legal teams were frantically drafting liability shields. And the sheer, unfiltered panic of a company bleeding out in real time filled the air. I knew exactly what time the direct deposits went out. Sitting comfortably at my kitchen table, having returned from the peaceful isolation of the mountains the night before, I decided to temporarily lift the digital blockade on my phone just to observe the wreckage. The device nearly vibrated right off the wooden table. Over 150 missed calls populated the screen in seconds, followed by a relentless, flashing waterfall of text messages and voicemails. The earliest messages were from Evelyn, the Director of Human Resources. Her text started off tense but professional around 6:15, asking me to urgently call her back regarding a minor payroll glitch. By 8 o'clock, her tone had dissolved into outright hysteria. She was begging me to explain why the accounting software was actively trying to issue a single paycheck for $3 billion to a phlebotomist in New Jersey. Then came the messages from Preston. The arrogant kid who had dismissed me with a sneer just days ago was now leaving frantic, hyperventilating voice notes. He was crying. Actual, audible tears. He was pleading with me to tell him where the hidden formatting rules were, asking why the columns were hopelessly misaligned, and desperately demanding to know how to reverse the batch processing. The sheer terror in his voice was like a symphony. I did not reply to a single one of them. I picked up my freshly brewed dark roast, walked out the front door, and settled into the comfortable wooden rocking chair on my porch. The morning air was getting warm, promising another stifling southern afternoon. I had dragged a small portable television out onto the patio table and tuned it to a major regional news network. The breaking news banner flashing across the bottom of the screen read in bold red letters, "Unprecedented medical walkouts. Strike East Coast hospitals." A frantic reporter was standing outside a massive medical center in downtown Atlanta, shouting over the loud chants of striking healthcare workers who were holding makeshift cardboard signs. The reporter detailed the bizarre payroll collapse that had completely frozen the income of thousands of frontline workers. I leaned back in my chair, took a slow, savoring sip of my hot coffee, and watched the magnificent fire burn. My phone buzzed aggressively in my pocket for the 200th time. I casually pulled it out, muted the device, set it face down on the wooden planks, and turned the volume up on the television. The corporate sports car had finally hit the bottom of the canyon, and the resulting explosion was even more beautiful than I had ever imagined. By noon, the frantic phone calls completely stopped. The sudden silence was not a surrender. It was a tactical pivot. "Marcus, realizing that his shiny new management career was currently disintegrating on national television, decided to play his final, desperate card. A high-priority email landed in my personal inbox. The subject line was written in aggressive, capitalized letters, flagged with a digital read receipt. It was a formal legal threat, drafted on the official OmniMed Logistics corporate letterhead. I opened the document and read through the furious, pseudo-legal jargon. Marcus was officially accusing me of malicious data sabotage, breach of fiduciary duty, and the intentional destruction of corporate property. He explicitly threatened to drag me into a federal courtroom, promising to ruin me financially for the rest of my natural life. The final paragraph was a poorly disguised ransom note. He stated that if I immediately returned to the office, surrendered all of my proprietary software licenses, and repaired the payroll pipeline without requesting any financial compensation, the company would gracefully drop the criminal charges. It was a classic corporate bullying tactic, designed to terrify a solitary, unemployed tech worker into immediate submission. I did not panic. I did not even blink. I simply clicked the forward button and sent the entire threatening email to my personal attorney, a ruthless, brilliant man named Arthur, who treated corporate litigation like a competitive blood sport. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. Arthur was already laughing when I answered the call. I calmly explained the precise nature of the raw data that Preston had recklessly imported into his unsecured spreadsheet. I told Arthur about the specific formatting of the hospital export files. This was the critical, devastating detail that the executives had completely ignored in their rush to fire me. The raw shift logs did not just contain employee identification numbers and hours worked, because these were trauma centers and emergency rooms. The raw text files frequently included highly sensitive nursing shift notes. These notes contained employee medical clearance statuses, post-exposure prophylaxis tracking for nurses who had dealt with infectious diseases, and crucially, specific patient intake codes linked directly to the attending staff. For 2 years, my secure encrypted middleware had carefully stripped all of that protected medical data out of the stream before passing the clean payroll numbers to the accounting department. But Preston had bypassed the security protocols. He had dumped hundreds of thousands of lines of raw, unfiltered medical records directly into an unencrypted Microsoft Excel file, hosted on a standard, non-secure desktop computer. To make matters infinitely worse, he had then emailed that corrupted file across the internal company network to his management team, desperately trying to get them to fix his broken macro. "They are not looking at a civil sabotage case," Arthur said, his voice dripping with pure predatory joy. "They are looking at a catastrophic, multi-state violation of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act." Arthur immediately drafted our response. He did not reply to Marcus. Instead, he sent a certified legal notice directly to the chief executive officer of the entire OmniMed conglomerate, copying the corporate board of directors and the general counsel. The email was a masterpiece of legal destruction. Arthur politely informed them that any lawsuit against me would immediately trigger a mandatory discovery phase, during which we would be legally obligated to notify the federal government, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation about their massive, unencrypted medical data breach. We outlined the exact federal statutes they had broken, noting that the penalties for the willful neglect of protected health information carried mandatory criminal liability, including severe prison sentences for the executive officers involved. The corporate arrogance of OmniMed Logistics evaporated in exactly 12 minutes. That was exactly how long it took for the chief executive officer to read the email and realize he was standing directly on the trapdoor of a federal prison cell. Inside the corporate headquarters, absolute pandemonium broke out. According to a friend still working in the billing department, the chief executive officer personally marched down to the operations floor. Marcus, realizing he was completely trapped, immediately tried to shift the blame onto Preston, screaming that the young graduate had acted alone and built the macro without executive oversight. The chief executive officer did not care. The fire had grown way too large for scapegoats. The company was bleeding millions of dollars by the hour. The massive hospital networks were threatening to cancel their supply contracts, and the very real shadow of a federal indictment was looming over the boardroom. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a sleek black town car pulled into my driveway. A sweating, breathless courier in a sharp uniform stepped out and practically ran up to my front porch. He was holding a thick manila envelope sealed with red tape. I stood up from my rocking chair and opened the door. "Miss Campbell," the courier gasped, "I was instructed to wait for your signature. It is an emergency consulting retainer directly from the Chief Executive Officer of OmniMed." I took the envelope, tore the seal, and pulled out the crisp legal document. It was a temporary independent contractor agreement. All previous threats of litigation were entirely gone. In their place was a desperate offer for $1,000 per hour, with a guaranteed minimum payout of 50 hours, if I would just come back and restore the servers immediately. I looked at the courier. I looked at the frantic, desperate signature of the chief executive officer at the bottom of the page. Then, I turned around, walked 2 steps into my home office, grabbed the heavy-duty paper shredder sitting next to my desk, and carried it right out to the porch. I plugged the machine into the outdoor outlet, while maintaining direct, unblinking eye contact with the horrified courier. I fed the $1,000 per hour contract directly into the grinding steel blades. "Tell your boss," I said smoothly over the loud hum of the motor, "that my rates have gone up." The sound of the paper shredder had barely faded into the warm afternoon air when my cell phone rang again. This time, it was not the frantic human resources director or the panicked vice president. The caller identification displayed the direct private line of the chief executive officer of the entire OmniMed conglomerate. I let it ring 4 times before I finally pressed the answer button. "Harper," the voice on the other end said. It was thin, trembling, and entirely stripped of the usual corporate bravado. "Please do not hang up." "I am listening," I replied, keeping my tone as flat and unreadable as concrete. The chief executive officer sounded like a man standing on the edge of a very high building. "The hospitals are formally drafting breach of contract lawsuits as we speak. The legal department is utterly paralyzed by the federal compliance violations. Marcus and Preston have completely locked up the server architecture trying to undo their own damage, and the payroll pipeline is dead. We are facing absolute bankruptcy and federal indictments. Tell me what it will take, whatever you want. Just name your price to fix this." I leaned back in my rocking chair, watching the sun slowly begin to dip below the tree line. This was the moment. This was the absolute peak of the mountain. The glorious, blood-soaked victory that every blue-collar tech worker dreams about when they are ignored in the hallways by men in expensive suits. I did not rush. I let the silence stretch out, forcing the most powerful man in the company to marinate in his own sheer terror. "I have 3 distinct conditions," I said slowly, dictating the new laws of gravity to a falling man. "First, I require an immediate, non-refundable emergency triage fee of $50,000. I want that wired directly into my checking account before we speak another word. Second, I am returning under the official title of Director of Systems Operations, and my annual salary will be exactly 3 times what I was making on Tuesday morning. Third, Marcus and Preston are to be terminated with cause. Immediately. I want them completely out of the building before I arrive." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a defeated sigh. "Done. I will personally authorize the wire transfer right now. Please, just get here as fast as you can." Exactly 10 minutes later, a notification pinged on my phone. The bank application confirmed an incoming wire transfer of $50,000. It was blood money, pure and simple. I grabbed my car keys and the encrypted hard drive containing my middleware, and I drove back into the city under the cover of darkness. The corporate headquarters was a ghost town when I pulled into the executive parking lot. As I walked through the main sliding glass doors into the lobby, I saw him. Preston was standing by the security desk. The arrogant kid who had bragged about saving the company hundreds of thousands of dollars was now clutching a small cardboard box filled with his designer desk accessories. His face was red, and he was openly crying, waiting for his ride home. I did not say a single word. I did not even look at him. I just walked right past him. the sharp click of my boots echoing off the marble floor, carrying the absolute weight of a conquering general. I swiped my newly activated executive keycard to enter the frozen server room. The air was ice cold. I walked straight to the primary terminal, pulled my personal hard drive from my pocket, and plugged it directly into the mainframe. I bypassed the catastrophic mess that Preston had created with his fragile macro. I opened a command prompt, typed out a series of swift override commands, and relinked my proprietary middleware back into the primary data flow. I purged the corrupted cache, reset the firewall permissions, and engaged the automated formatting filters. It took exactly 12 minutes. 12 minutes to completely resolve a massive, multi-state disaster that an entire team of highly paid executives and a Master of Business Administration graduate had failed to fix for 3 agonizing days. The terminal screen flared green. The massive backlog of raw hospital data rushed through my system, perfectly standardized, sanitized, and safely delivered to the accounting department. An hour later, I was sitting in my brand-new, massive glass office on the executive floor. The city lights of Atlanta sparkled outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. I leaned back in the plush leather chair, pulled a cigarette from my purse, and lit it right there in the middle of the room. Completely ignoring the strict corporate fire hazard policies, I watched the green lights blinking rhythmically on my monitor, confirming that the payroll pipeline was functioning flawlessly once again. I smiled through the smoke. Let this be a brutal, permanent lesson to the corporate suites of the world. You can have all the visionary synergy and fancy spreadsheets you want, but you should never, ever cross the quiet person who holds the keys to the kingdom. Thank you so very much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know in the comments. If you found today's story entertaining and satisfying, please consider supporting our team with just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by using the PayPal link provided in the description and pinned comment below. Your kindness helps our hardworking staff feed their families and ensures we can continue producing and sharing these great revenge stories with all of you. Stay strong and have a wonderful day.